Thank you to my friend, Dr. Davoud Mouradian, and all of you for the opportunity to participate in this Herat security dialogue. It is a particular honor as I consider myself part Herati after enjoying the hospitality of my great Herati friends. And it is clearly a critical time for Afghanistan, the region, and the world, as the United States concluded an ill-conceived and fundamentally flawed agreement with the Taliban, and in making the concessions it made, put not only the Afghan negotiating team in Doha, but all Afghans in a very difficult position. So I thought that I would provide my perspective on how our shared experience over nearly 2 decades produced the current situation, and some thoughts about what we must do together to protect the freedoms Afghans have enjoyed since 2001 and build a better future for Afghans and all humanity. America's frustrations and disappointments over its long, costly war in Afghanistan are due in part to inconsistent and ineffective strategies based on a short-term approach to a long-term problem set. The desire for a quick victory in Afghanistan impelled a very successful initial military campaign that unseated the Taliban government. But America's short-term mentality led to a neglect of tasks critical to supporting a sustainable political outcome in Afghanistan and the region, necessary to render the Taliban and other terrorist organizations in the region incapable of ever again committing mass murder attacks on the scale of 9/11. Soon after the Taliban fled the Afghan capital of Kabul, America's attention turned to the war in Iraq. As what was supposed to be another short war there morphed into a protracted counterinsurgency campaign, the Taliban regenerated in Pakistan with the help of Al Qaeda and the Pakistan Army's intelligence arm, the Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI. In 2009, the Barack Obama administration, coping with a financial crisis and sensitive to growing American impatience with the war, prioritized the departure of US troops over what was necessary to achieve a sustainable outcome consistent with US interests. The administration created a myth that the Taliban was distinct from Al Qaeda and doubled down on naive efforts to support and cooperate with Pakistan while limiting support for Afghan forces fighting the Taliban. Self-delusion resulted in a narrow focus to defeat Al Qaeda in Pakistan and negotiate with, rather than fight against and defeat the Taliban. It is true that if security in Pakistan collapsed or if Pakistan became completely estranged from the West, the jihadist terrorist threat to the region and the world could increase dramatically. And an isolated, desperate Pakistan might initiate another war with India, a war that could lead to nuclear devastation in one of the world's most populous regions. But the US approach to Pakistan since 9/11 often assumed that the Pakistani army and the ISI would, in exchange for US economic and military assistance, reduce support for and ultimately act against the Taliban and other terrorist networks based inside Pakistan. US leaders consistently underestimated the degree to which the Pakistani army's obsessive fear of India drives Islamabad's foreign policy. Pakistan's generals support the Taliban and other terrorist organizations because they want to control at least portions of Afghanistan to provide the strategic depth essential in their minds to prevent India from encircling them with an Afghan government friendly to New Delhi. Today, Afghan leaders are attempting to follow up on a peace agreement that the Donald Trump administration signed with the Taliban on February 29th, 2020 in Doha, Qatar. but the agreement abandoned a long-term approach in favor of satisfying the desire to disengage from the war. So, as the US restates its intention to withdraw and inter Afghan talks stall, the Taliban have intensified heinous attacks against Afghan security forces and innocent civilians while launching offensives aimed at gaining control of key areas along the Pakistani border and associated with the lucrative narcotics trade. After attacks on a maternity hospital and on American University of Afghanistan, no one should harbor any illusions about what living under Taliban rule would look like. A return of the brutal repression of freedom, torture, mass executions, and persecution of anyone who does not adhere to their perverted interpretation of religion. It is unclear how a Biden administration will regard Afghanistan and whether it will recognize the fundamental flaws in the Trump administration strategy. Sadly, the Trump administration's flaws were a magnified version of those of the Obama administration. But it may be possible that faced with the inescapable brazen intransigence of the Taliban, that the United States and coalition partners will recognize the need for a consistent, sustainable, long-term strategy based on what the situation demands rather than wishful thinking. That strategy should be grounded in three realities that Afghans should explain to the free world. First, counterterrorism operations from over the horizon will be ineffective if security collapses in Afghanistan. Courageous Afghan soldiers and police are bearing the brunt of the fight against the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations. Second, the Taliban is intertwined with other terrorist groups. Multinational efforts should focus on dismantling the terrorist ecosystem in South Asia. Because the Taliban is part of that ecosystem, it will not separate from it. Third, Pakistan will not end or dramatically reduce its support for the Taliban or other jihadist terrorist groups unless the costs of continued support for terrorists becomes too great. Based on those three realities, a long-term strategy should endeavor to support and incentivize Afghan leaders' efforts oriented on three objectives. First, to strengthen and harden Afghanistan against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which lies across the border in Pakistan. This will require improving governance and rule of law, reducing the strength of criminalized patronage networks that are stakeholders in state weakness, continuing to improve the effectiveness of the Afghan national security forces. Second, to convince Afghanistan's neighbors to play a more constructive, or in the cases of Pakistan and Iran, a less destructive role. In particular, the US and other nations must act together to convince Pakistani leaders that it is in their best interest to pursue diplomacy rather than use terrorists to advance their foreign policy. Others who have a stake in a secure Afghanistan, such as UAE, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and maybe even China, should withhold aid and assistance if the ISI does not end its support for the Taliban, including the Haqqani network and other terrorist organizations, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, that pose a threat to all humanity. Third, to sustain international support for Afghanistan. This will require explaining to American, European, and other citizens what is at stake in Afghanistan and how a strategy of helping Afghans bear the brunt of the fight to maintain their own freedom and defeat the enemies of all humanity on a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization is important to their own security. Those citizens should also understand that sustained international support is relatively low cost, especially compared to worst case scenarios should security in Afghanistan and South Asia deteriorate. In closing, I ask that all of you tell the story of the Afghan people. Help Americans and more people around the world understand what is at stake in Afghanistan and how hard all of you are working to secure a better future for your children and theirs. Tasha Kaur.